They say evil wears many masks. Like prayers, handsome men, faithful love, devotion everlasting. Those stories became her refuge, her hope, her vision of what life might one day be. At 16, pressured into marriage, Nannie wed Charlie Braggs, a quiet man who seemed steady, almost shy. For Nannie, it felt like her storybook life was finally beginning, but fairy tales rarely survive reality. The Braggs' home smelled of wood smoke and damp laundry that never fully dried. And in that small house lurked Charlie's mother, a domineering woman who watched and criticized Nannie's every move, how she cooked, how she cleaned, even how she held her babies. 4 children came in quick succession, their cries filling the house, their small feet pattering across creaking floors. Charlie, overwhelmed, withdrew into silence. He wasn't cruel, just absent, and his mother's shadow filled the space between them. Neighbors saw only the surface. They saw Nannie hanging laundry, humming softly, smiling through her exhaustion. But behind closed doors, her sweetness was curdling. She wanted romance, devotion, excitement. Instead, she had endless chores, a loveless husband, and a mother-in-law who made her feel small. And inside her, something darker began to stir. It began with tragedy. 2 of her children, healthy one day, gasping the next, fell suddenly ill. Their little bodies burned with fever, their cries fading into silence. Doctors suggested food poisoning, maybe the flu. In those days, child death was sadly common, and so no one asked too many questions. Charlie mourned deeply, clinging to the 2 daughters who survived. But Nannie's grief was strange. She giggled nervously at the funeral, wiping tears quickly as if embarrassed to be seen. Neighbors said it must be shock. Grief makes people act strangely. But for Nannie, those funerals were not an end. They were a beginning. Charlie began to suspect something. He could never put it into words, but he felt uneasy, even frightened, when his wife stirred the pot on the stove or handed him a cup of coffee. He refused meals at times, pushing plates away with weak excuses. Nannie only laughed, her soft, girlish giggle echoing through the small kitchen. It chilled him. One summer night, with cicadas humming outside, Charlie gathered his belongings, grabbed one of their daughters, and fled. He left the other child behind in Nannie's care, unable or unwilling to take her, too desperate to escape. Divorce carried heavy shame in those days, and Charlie spoke little about what he suspected. To neighbors, Nannie remained a young mother. In her garden, smiling, her laughter drifting out the window like everything was perfectly ordinary, but it was not. With Charlie gone, Nannie turned to the Lonely Hearts columns. She scrawled her desires in looping handwriting, filling letters with giggles in the margins, promises of devotion and sweetness. And men responded. Their words carried the smell of ink and hope, of farms and factories, of lonely nights. Nannie charmed them with her warmth, her girlish laughter, her promise of love. That was how she met Frank Harrelson, a factory worker with a rough edge. He drank too much, gambled, but he made Nannie feel wanted at first. They married quickly, swept up in passion. Once again, Nannie believed she had found her happily ever after, but whiskey soured everything. Frank became cruel, his words sharp, his fists pounding the table as bottles piled up. When the war ended in 1945, towns across America filled with music and joy, but inside Nannie's home, the nights were filled with Frank's drunken rants and the clatter of glass shattering against wood. Her fairy tale had soured again, and this time she knew what to do. Poison was a housewife's secret. Rat poison could be bought cheaply in little packets at the general store. Stirred into stew or coffee, it dissolved almost invisibly, leaving only a bitter trace disguised by sugar. Nannie knew this. She had heard women gossip, she had read about it, and she understood its quiet power. One night, Frank staggered home, reeking of whiskey and perfume. He collapsed on the bed, boots still on, and passed out. By the late 1940s, widows weren't unusual. War had left many women alone, some mourning, some rebuilding. And Nannie fit neatly into that world, the grieving wife, the unlucky woman cursed by tragedy. She leaned into the role, even enjoyed it, because it gave her cover. It allowed her to seek new men, new romances, new stories to chase. And once again, she turned to the Lonely Hearts columns. The words of strangers became her stage. She knew just what to write. Little flourishes of affection, declarations of loyalty, promises of home-cooked meals and gentle hands. Her letters carried the rhythm of a dreamer, her laughter scribbled into the margins. Men, aching for love after war and loneliness, could not resist. That was how she found Arlie Lanning. Arlie was from North Carolina, a factory worker with tired eyes and a ready smile. He liked his drink, he liked his cigarettes, and he liked the thought of a woman waiting at home for him. Nannie gave him all that and more. They married quickly, another whirlwind courtship sealed with vows that felt almost rehearsed. To neighbors, they seemed mismatched. He was rough, she was sweet, but love was love. And in those post-war years, no one asked too many questions. The little town of Lexington soon grew accustomed to the sound of Nannie's giggles drifting out from her porch. She was the doting wife, fussing over her husband, bringing pies to neighbors, talking brightly about the future. But the future with Arlie was no fairy tale. His drinking grew worse. Nights stretched long with his absences. His money disappeared at bars, and his temper sometimes flared hot enough to make her flinch. The men in town shrugged. Arlie had always been that way. The women whispered that poor Nannie deserved better. What they didn't know was that Nannie had already decided she would have better. Arlie's health began to fail suddenly. He grew weak, pale, unable to keep food down. Doctors muttered about the flu, perhaps pneumonia, something that had gripped him quickly and cruelly. Nannie sat at his bedside, holding his hand, her soft laugh bubbling as she brushed his damp hair back from his forehead. He looked into her eyes and saw only devotion. He never suspected that devotion was killing him. When Arlie finally died, Nannie was praised as the perfect wife, the grieving widow. Once again, fate had stolen her happiness, and once again she bore it with a strange, fragile cheer. She moved into his family's home for a while, still laughing, still baking pies, still playing the role of the sweet survivor. But then, curiously, that house caught fire, burned down completely, the insurance money slipping neatly into Nannie's pockets. Another stroke of bad luck, people said. Poor woman, cursed again. But luck had nothing to do with it. Arlie's death, the fire, the sympathy, it all left her hungry for more. And so Nannie packed her things and drifted back to her family. She visited her mother, Louisa, now frail and dependent. Nannie's daughters were grown, some married, some with children of their own. She played the role of doting daughter, the laughing mother, the playful grandmother. Her giggles charmed the children. Her pies delighted the family. But death had become part of her rhythm, and it was never long before the shadow followed. Her mother, Louisa, grew ill while Nannie stayed with her. Neighbors thought age had finally caught up, but the swiftness of her decline startled them. She complained of stomach pain, nausea, a gnawing weakness that consumed her in days. Nannie was there at the bedside, laughing softly, patting her hand, feeding her spoonfuls of broth. Louisa died quietly, her daughter's smile the last thing she saw. But grief did not linger in Nannie's home. She moved quickly, restlessly. Letters once again filled her hands, Lonely Hearts ads once again became her hunting ground. And soon another man answered her call. His name was Richard Morton, a widower from Kansas, lonely, searching for companionship. His letters were tender, filled with hope. Nannie responded with her usual charm, her promises, her giggling notes. When they met, For a woman like Nannie, who had always chased excitement, who had always longed for the fantasy of passion, Samuel was suffocating. His rules, his routines, his quiet disapproval grated at her. And once again, the smile she wore grew tighter, the laugh sharper, edged with impatience. Samuel fell ill only months after their wedding. His body weakened quickly, the familiar signs of poison blooming in his veins. He grew suspicious, refusing food, questioning the strange taste in his coffee. He survived one close call, spending weeks in the hospital recovering. Doctors warned him to be careful with his diet, to avoid contaminated food. Samuel returned home cautious, wary, but Nannie was patient. She laughed, she smiled, she waited. When he regained some strength, she offered him another meal, another drink, her eyes sparkling, her giggle floating like a melody. And this time, Samuel Doss did not survive. His death should have been another closed chapter, another grave covered in flowers and sympathy. But Samuel's doctor had been paying attention. The sudden relapse, the strange symptoms, the speed of decline, it did not sit right. Quietly, the doctor ordered an autopsy. For the first time in nearly 2 decades of laughter and graves, the truth was about to slip through Nannie's fingers, and the mask of the giggling granny was about to crack. The death of Samuel Doss should have been another quiet chapter in Nannie's book of tragedy. A black dress, a trembling veil, a nervous little laugh at the wrong time, and then a coffin lowered into the earth. For years, this pattern had fooled everyone. Neighbors, doctors, even family. They all explained it away as bad luck, fate, the curse of a woman who just couldn't seem to hold on to happiness. But Samuel was not like the others. He had been cautious, suspicious. He had spent weeks in the hospital before his final collapse, recovering from a mysterious illness that doctors could not explain. And his physician, Dr. Hall, had been watching closely. The moment Samuel's body returned to the morgue, the doctor pushed for an autopsy. The results confirmed his darkest fears. The tissues of Samuel Doss's organs showed unmistakable traces of arsenic. He had not died from natural causes. He had been poisoned. For the first time in nearly 2 decades of smiling funerals, the mask of Nannie Doss began to crack. The police came quietly to her doorstep in Tulsa. She greeted them with that same wide smile, a plate of cookies in her hand, her giggle rising like music, as if she were hosting guests rather than facing suspicion. But when they explained the autopsy results, when they asked her to accompany them for questioning, the smile faltered ever so slightly. She knew the game had changed. At the police station, under the harsh glare of a swinging bulb, Nannie sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore a floral dress, her hair curled soft around her face. She looked more like a grandmother waiting for church service than a suspect in a murder case. Detectives circled her with questions, their voices steady, their eyes searching. Why had her husband died so suddenly? Why had his body shown such high levels of arsenic? Nannie giggled. That light, airy sound filled the room, startling the men across the table. She spoke of bad luck, of a lifetime cursed by tragedy. Her laugh trailed through her words like smoke, disarming, confusing. But the detectives pressed harder. The evidence was undeniable. Samuel had not died by accident. Someone had fed him poison, hours stretched into the night. Cigarette smoke hung heavy in the interrogation room, mingling with the scent of stale coffee. Papers shuffled, typewriters clacked in the distance. Nannie remained composed, even cheerful, her laughter bubbling up at the oddest moments. When they asked about Samuel's meals, when they described his agonizing death, even when they confronted her with the autopsy report. But something in her began to loosen. Perhaps it was relief. Perhaps it was the thrill of finally being seen for who she truly was. With a sigh that sounded almost playful, Nannie began to talk. And once she started, she did not stop. Her confession spilled out in giggles and sighs, a story so monstrous the detective struggled to believe her at first. She admitted to poisoning Samuel. Yes, she had stirred arsenic into his coffee, into his pie. But Samuel was only the most recent. She spoke casually of Frank Harrelson, of Richard Morton, of Arlie Lanning, of Charlie Braggs. One by one, she named them, each husband falling sick, each one meeting death with her at his side. The detectives stared, horrified, as she continued. She told them about her children, 2 little ones who had died so suddenly in her first marriage. She mentioned her mother, Louisa, who had grown weak and slipped away under her care. Even her own sister, Dovie, who had lingered sick in bed until Nannie's spoonfuls of medicine finished the job. All of it, she confessed, with a smile on her lips and laughter in her voice. The room fell silent, except for the scratch of a pen racing across paper. The detectives glanced at each other, shaken. They had expected perhaps 1 murder, maybe 2. But this was a pattern that stretched across decades, a trail of graves stretching from Alabama to North Carolina to Kansas to Oklahoma. And at the center of it all sat a grandmotherly woman who giggled as she described feeding her loved ones. Poison. Nannie explained her motives with chilling simplicity. Some husbands had been cruel, some unfaithful, some merely dull. Family members had been inconvenient, in the way, burdens she no longer wished to bear. And always there was the fantasy, the romance stories she had devoured as a girl, the dream of true love and devotion. Every marriage had begun as a fairy tale. But when the reality failed to match her dream, Nannie ended the story herself. The detectives asked if she felt remorse. She laughed. They asked if she had loved any of them. She giggled again, shrugging, as though love was just another word from one of her magazines. They asked why she confessed so freely. She smiled, her eyes shining, and said, "I just like to talk." News of her arrest spread quickly. Newspapers seized on the story, christening her with names that would echo for decades. The Giggling Granny, the Lonely Hearts Killer. Photographs of her smiling in custody, her cheeks plump, her eyes sparkling, horrified readers across the country. How could such a harmless-looking woman hide such darkness? How could a grandmother's laugh mask a trail of death? As investigators dug deeper, the number of suspected victims grew. They exhumed bodies, tested tissues, pieced together timelines. Everywhere Nannie had gone, death had followed. Husbands, children, sisters, mothers, all poisoned by the same gentle hands that had baked pies and folded laundry. In Oklahoma, the district attorney prepared to try her for the murder of Samuel Doss. But whispers rose from every state she had lived in. Other prosecutors wanted their chance. Other families wanted answers. Yet it was Samuel's case that would stand because his autopsy was undeniable and Nannie's confession was overwhelming. Still, even in the face of possible execution, Nannie remained cheerful. She giggled with reporters, flirted with jailers, laughed at the mention of her crimes. Her lack of remorse unsettled everyone who met her. She seemed almost pleased to be the center of attention, as though her life had finally become the storybook she had always dreamed of, dramatic, exciting, filled with people hanging on her every word. In the jailhouse at night, the corridors echoed with the sound of her laughter. Other prisoners muttered prayers, shivered under blankets, unsettled by the way the giggles floated down the halls like the laughter of a child in a graveyard. For investigators, it was not just the scale of her crimes that disturbed them. It was the ordinariness of her tools, the simplicity of her methods. A packet of poison from a store, a pot of coffee, a slice of pie. No violence, no blood, just the quiet, invisible hand of arsenic slipped into everyday life. And behind it all, a smile. As the trial loomed, prosecutors prepared to reveal her secrets to the world. Witnesses were lined up, autopsy reports gathered, her own words transcribed into evidence. The nation was about to hear the story of a grandmother who giggled as she killed, and in her cell, Nannie laughed softly to herself as though she already knew how the story would end. By the fall of 1954, America could not get enough of Nannie Doss. Newspapers printed her smiling face on the front page, her cheeks plump, her curls neat, her eyes sparkling like any sweet grandmother one might meet at church. But the headlines beneath those photographs told another story. One of arsenic, of funerals that came too often, of a laugh that haunted the men who interrogated her. In small towns across Oklahoma and Kansas, neighbors whispered to one another over fences, and in grocery stores, mothers clutched their children tighter, husbands eyed their wives cooking with suspicion, and women shivered at the thought that one of their own, a housewife, a pie baker, a woman with a nervous giggle, could hide something so monstrous. Inside the jailhouse, Nannie basked in the attention. Reporters came to interview her, and she welcomed them with smiles, batting her lashes, giggling at their questions as though she were a starlet rather than a serial killer. She spoke freely of her marriages, of her disappointments, of how romance had always betrayed her. Her voice carried the cadence of gossip shared on a front porch. She made poison sound like an everyday household solution, a little trick every woman might keep tucked away. One reporter later recalled the chill that ran down his spine when she laughed, describing the moment she stirred arsenic into her husband's pie. She had leaned close to him, her voice playful as though sharing a recipe. "They never did suspect," she giggled, eyes glittering. But not everyone was charmed. Prosecutors and investigators worked day and night, sifting through her confessions, trying to untangle fact from fantasy. For Nannie was a storyteller, and like the romance magazines she adored, her tales sometimes blurred the line between truth. Sudden illnesses, his suspicions, his final decline. They described Nannie's strange laughter at his funeral, her oddly calm demeanor. The jurors shifted in their seats, watching Nannie closely, and through it all, she smiled. When asked directly about the murders, she did not deny them. She admitted what she had done, sometimes with a shrug, sometimes with a giggle that rippled through the hushed courtroom. To many in the gallery, it felt as though she were not on trial at all, but rather performing a role: the unlucky widow, the lonely heart's dreamer, the sweet granny with a nervous laugh. The judge and jury, however, were not swayed. They saw not just a grieving widow, but a calculating woman who had laced pies and coffee with death, who had turned the warmth of a kitchen into a weapon. When the verdict was read, guilty of murder in the first degree, the courtroom erupted. Reporters dashed to telephones, jurors avoided her gaze, and Nannie laughed. That same high, girlish laugh that had carried her through funerals, interrogations, and now her conviction. But the question remained: what punishment should she face? Oklahoma still had the death penalty, and many demanded it. A woman who had confessed to killing husbands, children, mothers, even her own sister, surely she deserved the electric chair. But others balked at the thought. To execute a grandmother, to strap a woman into the chair, was the state prepared for that? In the end, the court spared her from execution. Some said it was because she was a woman. Others believed it was because of her mental state, her giggling demeanor suggesting instability. Whatever the reason, Nannie Doss was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The headlines roared again. Giggling Granny escapes electric chair. Life sentence for laughing poisoner. When she was led away, shackled, but smiling, she turned to the reporters gathered and said cheerfully, "I'll be fine." The prison gates closed behind her, but her legend only grew. She became a morbid fascination. Her photographs circulated in true crime magazines. Her story whispered in kitchens and living rooms. Housewives wondered aloud if they could ever truly know the women next door. Husbands stirred their coffee with new caution. Children whispered ghost stories about the laughing granny who killed with pie. In her cell, Nannie adapted easily. She tended the prison gardens, smiled at guards, giggled with other inmates. To many, she seemed harmless, even cheerful, but the truth lingered in every shadow. This was a woman who had poisoned at least 11 people, who had turned laughter into a mask for death. She would live behind bars for the rest of her days, her crimes sealed into the annals of American true crime history. But the world outside never stopped wondering. How many graves bore her secret? How many family dinners had been laced with her quiet, deadly touch? And even in prison, even as the years wore on, the sound of her giggle never faded. For those who heard it, it was not the sound of joy. It was the echo of poison. Prison walls closed around Nannie Doss in 1955, but they never seemed to weigh on her the way they did on others. For many inmates, the gates clanged shut like a coffin lid. For Nannie, it was almost as if she had simply stepped into another stage, another role to play. She laughed when the matron gave her prison clothes. She giggled as she was shown to her cell. She seemed almost delighted, as though incarceration were an adventure, not a life sentence. The Oklahoma State Penitentiary was not a kind place. The air smelled of disinfectant and sweat. The corridors rang with clanging doors and shouts. The nights echoed with muffled sobs and whispers. Yet Nannie floated through it with her familiar smile. To guards and inmates alike, she was polite, even charming. She tended the gardens, sewed with the other women, told funny stories about her life. And always the giggle, high, light, bubbling from her throat at the oddest moments, unsettling everyone who heard it. The other prisoners gave her space. Some feared her. Others couldn't reconcile the sweet-faced grandmother in her floral-patterned apron with the woman who had admitted to poisoning husbands, children, even her own mother. A few whispered questions in the yard. Do you think she'd do it again if she could? But no one asked her directly. Because sometimes, when she laughed, it sounded like the answer was yes. Guards spoke of her oddly calm presence. Unlike other inmates, she never fought, never raised her voice, never caused trouble. She followed the rules, smiled at inspections, thanked the matrons with exaggerated sweetness. But her reputation lingered. The guards checked their cups of coffee twice when she was around, even though she had no access to poison anymore. Fear was her shadow, and it followed her wherever she walked. Time inside prison moves differently. Days blur into weeks, weeks into years. And as the 1960s began, the outside world changed. Civil rights marches, new music, new freedoms. But inside the penitentiary, Nannie's world stayed much the same. She remained a curiosity, a dark legend among the inmates. New prisoners arrived whispering, "That's her, the Giggling Granny." They stared at the round-faced woman, who looked like someone's sweet aunt, until she smiled at them with those twinkling eyes. Occasionally, journalists still wrote about her. True crime magazines ran her photographs, always smiling, always giggling, and retold the lurid tale of her husbands who never lived to grow old. Her story fascinated because it contradicted everything people thought they knew about evil. She didn't look like a killer. She didn't act like one. She laughed, she baked, she doted on children, yet death had followed her hands like perfume. And so she lived year after year, her legend growing even as her world shrank to the size of her prison yard. By the early 1960s, however, the years began to show. Her round face sagged, her once neat curls now streaked with gray. Arthritis gnawed at her bones, slowing her movements. The giggle remained, though softer, more fragile, like a cracked bell. She still laughed at odd moments, when a fellow inmate cursed her fate, when a guard scolded another prisoner, when a bird landed on the prison fence. That laugh, even weaker, still sent shivers down the spines of those who heard it. Illness crept into her body like a final punishment. She began to spend more time in the prison infirmary, the smell of antiseptic replacing the gardens she once tended. Nurses found her peculiar. She joked with them, flirted with the doctors, giggled at her own failing health. She never spoke of regret, not once. When asked directly, she only smiled and said, "Well, they just didn't make me happy." In 1963, Nannie Doss was diagnosed with leukemia. The disease wasted her body quickly. Yet even as her strength faded, her spirit remained strangely buoyant. She laughed with the nurses, teased the chaplain who came to pray with her, and told stories of her younger years, painting them with the rosy glow of romance magazines she had once adored. She rarely mentioned the graves behind her. When she did, it was with that same unnerving giggle, as though death were nothing more than a punchline. Fellow inmates avoided her room in those final months. They said her laughter echoed in the halls at night, thin and brittle, like a ghostly echo. Some swore she chuckled in her sleep. Others claimed she hummed love songs under her breath, the kind she used to read in those old magazines, as though, even in dying, she still chased the fantasy of perfect romance. On June 2nd, 1965, Nannie Doss died in the prison hospital. She was 60 years old. The cause? Leukemia. Not poison, not violence. For once, she had not chosen the timing. Her death barely made the papers compared to the frenzy of her arrest a decade earlier. A few short obituaries ran. Nannie Doss, known as Giggling Granny, dead at 60. Her body was buried quietly, without fanfare, without the crowds of mourners she had once entertained with her strange smiles at funerals. But her story did not die with her. It lingered in the public imagination, a tale told in whispers at kitchen tables, in late-night radio shows, in the pages of crime magazines. The grandmother who giggled as she confessed to killing her husbands. The sweet-faced woman who stirred arsenic into pies. The monster who wore a floral dress and a smile. In prison, the guards who had watched her all those years spoke of the odd emptiness left behind. Some admitted relief. Others said they almost missed the strange sound of her, laughter drifting down the hall, even though it had always made their skin crawl. For years afterward, prisoners would still talk about her, warning newcomers, That cell belonged to the Giggling Granny. Nannie Doss never saw herself as evil. To her dying day, she giggled at the suggestion, brushed off questions of guilt, and insisted she had simply been looking for love. But her search for romance left a trail of graves across 4 states, and her laughter remains one of the most chilling sounds in American true crime. She died as she had lived, smiling, laughing, hiding her darkness behind the sound of a grandmother's giggle. But for those who remembered her, for those who studied the path of poison she left behind, the question lingered long after she was gone. How many graves bore her secret? And how many people had shared one last meal with Nannie Doss, never knowing it would be their last? The world outside the prison gates moved on after Nannie's death, but her laughter echoed far beyond those walls. It haunted the newspapers, whispered through the radio broadcasts, and seeped into the imaginations of everyday Americans. In the quiet suburbs of the 1950s and early 60s, neat rows of pastel-painted houses, tidy lawns, church bells on Sundays, people couldn't stop thinking about the woman who had seemed so ordinary, so grandmotherly, yet carried arsenic-like, a weapon tucked beneath her apron. What unsettled them wasn't just Carolina recalled how she always seemed cheerful, humming as she tended her garden. In Alabama, women at church remembered her endless smile, her kindness in bringing pies to gatherings. But some admitted years later that something about her had made them uneasy. She laughed too much, one woman said, at things that weren't funny. You'd be talking about someone sick in the hospital and she'd just giggle, like she knew something you didn't. Experts tried to classify her. Was she a sociopath? A product of childhood trauma, of her father's harsh discipline and her early head injury from that train accident? Was she simply greedy, killing for insurance money? Or was she something harder to define, a woman who killed because she wanted, to rewrite her life story again and again until it finally matched the fantasy in her head? The truth seemed to lie somewhere in the space between. Yes, she collected insurance payouts, but she didn't always need the money. Yes, she had suffered in childhood, but many others had, and they didn't lace coffee with arsenic. What stood out most in every account was her dissatisfaction. The way she cycled through husbands like pages in a magazine, always chasing the next dream. And when reality disappointed her, she didn't leave. She erased. Her crimes forced the country to look at marriage, at love, at the dangerous illusions women were fed in that era. Magazines promised eternal romance, perfect husbands, devotion without struggle. But reality was harder. Alcohol, abuse, financial hardship, the grinding weight of expectation. For Nannie, that gap between fantasy and reality was unbearable. And instead of enduring it, she closed the gap with death. In kitchens across America, women whispered about her. Some feared her. Others, in darker moments, admitted they understood her frustration. A husband who drank too much, who shouted too, often who broke promises. Many women knew that pain. Nannie's response was horrifying, unthinkable. But the fact that she had smiled, laughed, and gotten away with it for so long sent a chill through countless households. Husbands, too, began to look differently at their wives across the dinner table. Poison was called the woman's weapon. In that era, a quiet killer hidden in food or drink. And Nannie embodied that fear. She turned domesticity itself into a threat. The pie cooling on the windowsill, the cup of coffee in the morning, the casserole at supper. Ordinary acts of love became suspect. Her case forced law enforcement to reckon with the hidden dangers of arsenic. It was common then, easy to buy, often used as rat poison. Forensic science lagged behind her crimes. Many of her early victims had been buried without suspicion, their deaths written off as stomach illnesses or food poisoning. Only when patterns emerged, husbands dying too quickly, relatives falling ill after meals, did investigators look closer. By then, years had passed, bodies had been buried, evidence had faded. How many graves contained her unseen hand? That question has never been answered. And still, through every retelling, every theory, every analysis, there was her laugh. Court reporters wrote about it. Detectives remembered it. Guards in the prison said it haunted them. One detective later recalled, "She sat there telling me how she put the poison in his coffee and she giggled, not once, not nervously, over and over like a little girl telling a secret. It was the most chilling sound I've ever heard." In that laugh was the mystery of Nannie Doss. Was it madness, malice, or the last remnants of a woman who never grew up, still clinging to the dream of a perfect love story that the world refused to give her? By the late 20th century, her story became a staple of true crime lore. Documentaries replayed her photographs, her plump cheeks, her curls, her wide smile. She looked like someone's grandmother, standing on a porch with her hands folded or seated in a floral dress with a sweet grin. The narration always told the same contrast. This was the face of a woman who murdered with a laugh. And with each retelling, people leaned closer, disturbed yet fascinated. Because Nannie Doss forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil does not always wear a snarl. Sometimes it giggles. Sometimes it bakes pies and brings flowers. Sometimes it looks like the person sitting across from you at the dinner table. That was her legacy, the terror of the ordinary. But beneath the fascination, beneath the horror, a quieter question lingers. One no one has ever been able to fully answer. Was Nannie Doss a cold-blooded killer from the start? Or was she a woman broken by disappointment, by a lifetime of unmet dreams, who found her only control in the finality of poison? The answer lies buried in the laughter that echoed long after she was gone, and in the graves that still may hold her secrets. Decades after Nannie Doss had gone, her story refused to fade. She became a shadow in the collective American memory, a whisper in true crime lore, a cautionary tale told in kitchens, classrooms, and courtrooms alike. Yet the fascination wasn't only in the deaths she caused, or even in the audacity of her crimes. It was in the contradiction she embodied. The harmless grandmother who was anything but harmless, the giggling woman whose hands carried death. television, and magazines began retelling her story in the 1970s and 80s, long after she had gone, dissecting her life in segments, dramatizing her crimes, and analyzing her psychology. Documentaries framed her as both a product and a predator, a woman shaped by decades of societal expectations and personal disappointments, who then took fate into her own hands. Scholars debated whether she was motivated by greed, lust, boredom, or some warped version of love. The truth, it seemed, could accommodate all those theories at once. For psychologists, Nannie became a textbook study in duality. She exhibited traits of psychopathy, manipulation, lack of remorse, charm. But she also displayed an almost childlike fascination with romance, a deep yearning for affection and attention. Her diaries, letters, and confessions revealed a woman who measured life not in ordinary years but in the intensity of her desires. She wanted love, comfort, excitement. And when reality failed to deliver, she created her own rules. She decided who would live, who would die, and who would be left behind to mourn in confusion. Media portrayals leaned into the darkly comic aspects of her personality. The nicknames, the endless string of husbands, the irony of a sweet-faced woman weaving terror with domesticity. Films and television specials highlighted the incongruity of her life. A woman who knitted and baked, who raised children and planted flowers, who carried arsenic with the same ease she carried sugar. She became a template in popular culture for what would later be called the domestic female killer, someone who used the ordinary rhythms of daily life as camouflage for extraordinary crimes. Yet beyond the analysis, beyond the fascination, lay the enduring human cost. Families still carried the weight of her actions. The children who had survived her first marriages lived with a haunting awareness of mortality that few could understand. Spouses, siblings, and parents wrestled with the cruel randomness of her poison, the way she turned intimacy into danger. Even strangers felt the tremor of fear. How could someone so ordinary, so familiar, hide such darkness? Victim advocacy groups later revisited her case, trying to understand what had gone unnoticed for so long. How had a woman who poisoned 11 people across 4 states managed to evade suspicion for decades? Investigators and historians concluded that her success lay in the combination of charm, social invisibility, and the predictable assumptions society held about women of her era. A grandmother couldn't possibly be a killer. A widow couldn't possibly be calculating. A giggling woman must be harmless. In popular culture, the echoes of her crimes persisted in subtle ways. Crime writers referenced her in anthologies of female killers. Horror and thriller scripts borrowed her duality, the blend of innocence and menace, warmth and terror. Even video games and podcasts about notorious killers mentioned her, highlighting the way she used domesticity as a weapon. The image of Nannie Doss, smiling while poisoning, became a symbol of the ultimate betrayal of trust, of the dangers hidden behind everyday appearances. For criminologists, her case offered endless lessons. Patterns of victim selection, methods of poisoning, manipulation of social perception, all became points of study. Nannie's letters, full of playful promises and tender words, were dissected for insight into how charm can mask malice. Her ability to navigate society, to blend in, to maintain a social mask while committing murder, became central in discussions about female serial killers and how they exploit cultural expectations. Even outside professional circles, Nannie inspired fear and fascination. Housewives recounted her story at sewing circles. Teachers introduced her as a case study in cautionary tales. Children were warned about trusting strangers, about paying attention to the signs, about the way appearances could deceive. And yet, there remained a certain dark humor in the story. The irony that a woman who had killed so many could be remembered for her giggle, for her curls, for the sweetness of her smile. By the 1990s and 2000s, the legend had solidified. True, Crime enthusiasts debated the number of her victims, speculated on those who had gone unnoticed, and tried to piece together the full map of her lethal journey. She was studied alongside men like Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy, but always marked as different because her crimes had been domestic, hidden in kitchens and bedrooms, carried out with the softest touch imaginable. Yet even with all the analysis, the fascination remained humanized. People wanted to understand her, to imagine what drove someone who could hold a baby in her arms one moment and slip poison into her husband's drink the next. Her story challenged assumptions about gender, about innocence, about the ways we perceive evil, and it forced a reckoning with the idea that appearances can never be fully trusted. Her crimes, her impossible duality, refused to fade from memory. People still whispered her name, the Giggling Granny, the lonely heart's poisoner. Each utterance carried a shiver, a reminder that the ordinary could conceal the unimaginable. In the quiet corners of history, her life was dissected endlessly. Psychologists debated her motives, true crime enthusiasts retraced her steps, journalists retold her confessions. Yet all these analyses could not entirely capture her essence. Nannie Doss was not just a list of victims or a pattern of poisonings. She was a paradox, a woman who sought love with the intensity of a child and destroyed life with the precision of a scientist. Families of her victims continued to live with echoes of her choices. Husbands who had survived her early marriages, children who had been spared, siblings who had watched in horror, each carried a shadow of fear, grief, and disbelief. Funerals became quieter testimonies to the chaos she had wrought. Stories of her crimes were retold at dinner tables, in classrooms, and in therapy sessions, a dark inheritance passed down through generations. Even in popular culture, Nannie left, a mark that outlived her corporeal presence. Films dramatized her life, novels fictionalized her methods, documentaries analyzed her psychology. Her image, a smiling grandmother, soft curls framing a plump face, eyes twinkling, became shorthand for the unnerving idea that evil could exist in familiar form. Writers, directors, and historians all returned to her story, searching for the invisible thread that allowed a woman to mask cruelty behind charm and domesticity, and yet, beyond the fascination and horror, there remained a deeper human truth. Nannie's victims were not merely statistics. They were lives interrupted, potential unrealized, families fractured. Each sip of coffee, each bite of pie, each hug and kiss she offered carried a hidden menace. The ordinary became a conduit for the extraordinary, the domestic transformed into a theater of death. Those who had studied her life remarked on the eerie normalcy she maintained, even in prison. She laughed, she tended gardens, she spoke politely to guards. Her demeanor was almost unnervingly gentle, a reminder that the human capacity for deception can be nearly limitless. And in that laughter, both in life and in recollection, lay the essence of her terror, a sound meant to comfort, yet forever associated with fear. Criminologists continue to cite her case as an example of how societal assumptions about gender, about appearance, about what constitutes danger, can obscure reality. Nannie Doss exploited those assumptions with meticulous skill. The woman in the floral dress, with her soft voice and warm smile, was allowed a freedom that male killers of her era would never have enjoyed. Her ability to slip through suspicion for decades is as much a testament to her cunning as it is to the blind spots of society. Her story also resonates today, in a world still captivated by true crime. Podcasts retell her crimes to listeners across the globe. Documentaries dramatize her life for viewers who are simultaneously horrified and fascinated. Each retelling reinforces the tension she created in life. The juxtaposition of innocence and malice, domesticity and murder, charm and terror. Even with decades of hindsight, Nannie's story retains a peculiar intimacy. She did not kill with weapons easily associated with violence. She did not force herself upon her victims or attack them in fits of rage. She killed through the quiet routines of home, through cups of coffee, through the meals meant to nourish. In this, her method was personal, intimate, almost tender in its horror. A reminder that evil can infiltrate spaces we consider safe, that trust can be weaponized, and that the familiar can conceal the unimaginable. And still, despite all the analysis, all the media, all the psychological studies, one question remains hauntingly unresolved. How did she reconcile herself to her own actions? Nannie Doss, the smiling grandmother, the woman who giggled through funerals, the inmate who laughed while describing her crimes, never offered remorse. She spoke freely, candidly, sometimes playfully, about taking lives, yet she never appeared burdened by conscience. To her, perhaps, she was merely correcting the failures of life, pursuing her own vision of love and happiness, unaware or uncaring of the cost to others. In classrooms, boardrooms, podcasts, and living rooms, she remains a warning. Not of evil that shouts or rages, but of evil that smiles, giggles, and pours tea. The most terrifying aspect of Nannie Doss is not the number of victims she claimed, nor the speed with which she claimed them. It is the realization that her crimes were possible precisely because she looked like a grandmother, because she behaved like a neighbor, because she appeared harmless. And so, as the years turn and memories fade, her story endures. In the quiet of an old kitchen, in the hum of a refrigerator, in the clink of a teacup, her legacy whispers still. The Giggling Granny remains both a figure of fascination and a cautionary shadow, an enduring symbol of trust betrayed, of appearances deceiving, and of laughter that conceals darkness. Somewhere, in the echoes of history, her giggle lingers, soft, high, and chillingly human. It is a reminder that evil can be charming, that terror can be domestic, and that the ordinary can harbor the extraordinary. And for those who remember her story, it is impossible to hear a grandmother's laugh without a shiver. Impossible to see a familiar smile without a fleeting thought of poison in the cup beside it. Nannie Doss is gone. The world is safer because she cannot strike again. But her laughter, that perhaps will never die. whispered corner,